Why did HIV/AIDS appear in the second half of the 20th century? Dr. Preston Marks points out that SIV has existed for thousands of years in many species of African monkeys and chimpanzees. People have been hunting and butchering them for just as long. So why didn't HIV/AIDS appear during the transatlantic slave trade, when millions of African people were brought to the Americas?
Certainly HIV, one version or another, would have been transported to America during our slave trade period. And I always talk about the 300 years of slave trade, the healthy young men and women that were brought to the country. The virus in them would have survived the voyage and would have been passed around in Louisiana, where I grew up, or in Georgia, or in South Carolina, or South America, or the Caribbean.
Dr. Marks's research also showed that SIV infections in human beings are relatively harmless and eventually die out.
When we found SIV-like viruses in human beings, they were perfectly healthy and they were dead ends. So what I thought was that the SIV did indeed cross over to people, but didn't create an epidemic. There was a spark.
Dr. Marks says SIV may have accidentally become HIV because of the reuse of contaminated needles and unscreened blood transfusions during Western medical campaigns conducted in Africa in the 1940s and 50s. The first blood sample containing HIV was taken from a man in the Congo in 1959.
SIV was a relatively harmless infection in human beings for 100,000 years. And then in the 50s, we started to move that virus from person to person by the reuse of needles. And that allowed the virus to adapt to a new species, us.
During the 1950s and 1960s, the West conducted massive medical campaigns in West and Central Africa. The goal was humanitarian, to wipe out killer diseases with injections of penicillin. An estimated 35 million African people got penicillin injections between 1952 and 1963.
WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF were the agencies that were doing vaccination programs in Africa. And they were doing penicillin injection programs in Central Africa. So that was a smoking gun.
Disposable syringes had just been invented. They were supposed to be used only once.
But nothing is disposable in survival economies. Everything gets recycled and reused. And these needles got reused again and again. They were not meant for reuse. They had these little nooks and crannies under the plunger where viral particles could and did hide. And we've done the research now and know that that's what happens.
So serial passage helps the virus to change, to become a new virus in a new species, in this case, human beings.
A man doesn't feel well. He is infected with SIV. He goes to the doctor and gets an injection. Some of his SIV-infected blood gets on the disposable syringe. Just cleaning the syringe will not get rid of the virus. Some of the SIV stays on the needle. That contaminated needle is then used on patient number 2. The SIV infection gets passed on to patient number 2. The SIV remains in the body of patient number 2 for a couple of weeks. During that time, the virus begins to adapt, taking on new characteristics that will help it survive in humans. Patient number 2, with the adapted virus, still doesn't feel well and goes back to the doctor for another injection. His infected blood is left on another needle, which is then used on patient number 3. As SIV-infected blood continues to be passed from patient to patient, the virus keeps adapting.
So now we're really getting up to now maybe 30 or 40 or 50 mutations. And I don't know, no one knows how many of the people it has to go through. But eventually the virus will be adapted to human beings and then be able on its own, without the help of a needle, move from person to person.
Transfusions, of course, are a perfect vehicle for transmitting a virus. 7 or 8, 10 countries introduced transfusions in 1950. 51, 52, 53, just the same exact period we were so interested in.
It's a theory. I don't have the proof. But what we have is a really plausible series of events that, that puts it at the head of the list. And that's really all that I can say. That's all I even claim. I don't claim that this is what happened. I said this appears to be the best explanation we have.
Dr. Marks says his serial passage theory is the only one that accounts for the appearance of both HIV-1 and HIV-2 in different regions of Africa.
The World Health Organization in Geneva got a bit uppity about it and didn't like it because others, not Marks and Drucker, were saying that the main spread in Africa today is more through needles than through sex. And whereas Marx is speaking about the past, this got muddled into what is the problem today. And the WHO know that the main problem is sexual transmission, also mother-to-child transmission. And therefore were overzealous to play down the past as well as today.
Other scientists have warned Dr. Marks about the political ramifications of his theory.
What are you saying this for? What are you trying to do? We can't get, vaccines and drugs into Africa now, and you want to say that it was Western medicine that did it? And again, my answer is the answer of a scientist. I'm sorry, I don't care. I only care about the facts. I mean, that's my job. And if it's going to hurt things, in the long run, it's going to be helpful. Because in the long run, we'll know what we did, if it's true. We'll know what we did, and we'll know how not to do it again.